Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you for being here this morning. Today's panel is concluding a mini project we've undertaken at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, a three-part series on the size and productivity of government in Canada. And the focus today is on Stephen Tapp's most recent paper on provincial productivity, which shows key differences and some very consistent trends across the provinces in the country. As we know, provinces vary greatly in size and in their local economic and cultural features, and this shows up in the size and productivity of their governments. Atlantic provinces operate large government sectors relative to their economies. Alberta, Ontario, and BC operate the leanest. Is that due to economies of scale in larger provinces, a more robust private sector? We shall see. And in terms of similarities, every province, without exception, has seen government grow larger and public sector productivity decline relative to the private sector over time. And we're going to drill down into three major service sectors: healthcare, K-12 education, and post-secondary, where we see similar tensions, more resources going in, but uneven or declining outputs and outcomes across the board. And that really raises the central question that's guided the series. Are Canadians getting value for money with their tax dollars? And what would it take to reverse these productivity woes? And with us today, we have a great panel to discuss the issue from multiple angles. Tim Sargent, my colleague, is a senior fellow and the domestic policy director here at MLI. He's a former deputy minister and senior civil servant in central and line ministries, from the Privy Council office to trade, finance, and fisheries and oceans. He understands the machinery of government very well and how intergovernmental dynamics shape outcomes, and also how trade and regulatory choices affect productivity. We also have Philip Cross, who's a senior fellow at MLI. He is a former chief economic analyst at StatsCan and a prolific Financial Post columnist who brings a macroeconomic lens showing how cyclical forces, investment patterns, and institutional choices shape productivity. And then we have Michael Keenan, who's a long-serving senior civil servant and former Deputy Minister at Transport and Associate Deputy Minister at Natural Resources Canada, who will help us understand how infrastructure, capital investment, and major project approvals affect productivity. And last but certainly not least, we have Stephen Tapp, who's the author of the three papers, who brings decades of experience at top Canadian economic institutions like Export Development Canada, the Bank of Canada, Parliamentary Budget Office, think tanks, and academia, and he's now the CEO and chief economist of the Centre for the Study of Living Standards. And I'm going to turn it over to Stephen to give us a brief introduction of what the paper tells us, so please give a warm welcome to Stephen Tapp.
All right, thank you very much, Peter. I appreciate the opportunity to skate through some slides. I know you don't want me to be too long, so I think you should see some packages around the table, and I'll just highlight a couple of the key points. This is, as Peter mentioned, this is the third in a three-part series. We're trying to look at measuring the size and trying to get at to crack this nut on productivity for the government sector in Canada. So if you turn to the second slide here in your package, you'll see some high-level context. So, of course, I think we all kind of appreciate the importance of government in the sense of the workforce. It's over 20% of the workforce is working in the government sector. Governments shape the conditions for growth and overall social economic well-being. So that's important. And really the motivation in this series of papers is to try to better understand the size and productivity, because we think that's going to help us get at improving service delivery in governments, ensuring fiscal sustainability, and hopefully enhancing living standards. The approach that I took in this series of papers is essentially a relatively straightforward one, where we develop a couple composite indexes, where we try to quantify the size and then the productivity of the government sector. And because of the well-known difficulties in measuring outputs in the government sector, we then also start to look at some more direct measures and alternative indicators. And the composite approach is essentially, rather than relying just on, let's say, the level of government spending, we're pulling together 6 or 7 different indicators so we can try to get a better signal and a more comprehensive look at what's happening. So the first section in the slides here will be government size. And so let me just give you a couple key findings on what we found. Slide 4 shows you the size of government index, which is bringing together 6 different indicators, and they're all available over 2007 to 2023 period. You can basically see the upward trend in that line, and the significant increases that happened in the recession and the pandemic in terms of the size of government. The index that we created has increased by about 1.6 percentage points, and that suggests that there's a larger government presence in the economy relative to going back to, let's say, 2007. I think people mostly accept that general finding. And if you start to dig into both the components and the activities of what's behind these changes, slide 5 shows you the components. So as I mentioned, we have 6 different indicators that we're pulling together here. Each is just getting an equal weight in the overall aggregate composite measure. And at the top of the list there is government spending. So the biggest driver and the biggest contributor to the increase in size of government over time has been the increase in government spending. You can go down the list there and see that essentially it's a larger fiscal footprint. Towards the bottom we have some other measures, but the most important part, I think, for the purpose of today's conversation is the column on the right, which shows you provincial increases. So not only do we have this by composite, by province as well, you can see that across most provinces, 9 provinces spending increased, 10 provinces hours worked increased. So that for the vast majority of provinces, there's been an increase in most of these indicators over the last 15 years or so. That's looking at a component lens. If you look at activities, which is on slide 6, you'll see we break things down into the health sector, education sector, and then government administration, and the various levels of government there that are shown. So not surprisingly, I think for most in the room, the health spending and health activities are the ones that have really driven the increase over time. And I think on the bottom that you'll see they're kind of ranked ordered. Again, increasing, every single province has had an increase in healthcare spending. Every single province has an increase in local, municipal, or Indigenous government size. And on the other side, it's a little bit more hit and miss. The education sector is actually shrinking over time and is not growing in as many provinces there. So that's a quick look at size across over time and what's driving things. On slide 7, you'll see a map of Canada, and that will show you essentially that this is the overall measure for 2023, where we're looking at where is government largest by these measures in Canada. The darker blue areas are the ones where there's a larger government sector, and the lighter colors, so you see Alberta has the smallest government sector in Canada, BC right after there. And if you're hanging out on the right-hand side of the chart there, you'll see between PEI and Nova Scotia, they've kind of jockeyed around between position 1 and 2, followed by New Brunswick and Newfoundland. In central Canada, Quebec has a larger government on average than the national average, and Ontario a little bit smaller. And you can see, again, some variation over time. That gives you some sense of what we found by size. I'll now jump into a few findings on government productivity. So this is the second part, turning to slide 9, where what we've done here is pulled together in terms of the composite. We're looking at output per hour worked, and we're looking at output per worker, and bringing those together in a composite measure, comparing the government sector compared to the business sector. And you can see, if you go all the way back to 1997, it used to be the case that the government sector had higher measured productivity based on these statistics than the business sector. And you can see that that premium has eroded to be a discount at this point in time and has significantly changed over the last 20 years or so. Put differently, regardless of what you think of the measures of productivity in the government sector, they have not been keeping pace with what's happening in the business sector, which shouldn't necessarily surprise too many people. We have done different cuts of this, so you can look at so-called productivity levels and you can look at relativities. In slide 10, we look at productivity levels here, and that paints, I think, Ontario in a relatively positive light, followed by Alberta and BC. It's important if you look at slide 11 that you'll see that the story is quite different if you compare to the business sector, between the government sector and business sector by province, or if you just look at overall measures of these output per worker. On the index by province for slide 11, you will see that Ontario still does relatively well, the government sector being a little bit ahead of the business sector. But the in difference there is in Atlantic Canada, where levels of productivity that were low when being compared with the business sector are actually higher. So we're seeing kind of somewhat a better measure of government productivity in Atlantic Canada. So I think there's 2 points I have here on that slide. The first is that benchmarks matter. So it matters whether we're comparing overall levels, whether we're comparing to the business sector. And secondly, it's been pointed out by reviewers of the papers and others, it's certainly possible that, let's say in Atlantic Canada, where governments are bigger, there could be competition, wage increases for government workers that feed through to the private sector. That could make things less competitive. So there could be some crowding out happening of government activity on the business sector, especially in Atlantic Canada. That could be a concern. So that is the first little bit on size and then productivity. Because we know it's hard to measure what the outputs really are in the government sector, Tim had another paper, I think, earlier this year. And Peter was suggesting as well, let's try to look at some other things that are maybe more direct. So we're not going to be adding up the costs of producing government services and making adjustments for depreciation and capital, et cetera. We'll just try to look at what we can for outputs of government systems. And so here, I'm just going to show you a couple highlights. Tim had looked at this slide 13 at the national level. And that is looking at, for the healthcare sector, there's many, many different ways we could assess quality and overall performance of the healthcare sector. But one is just by looking at wait times. So the Fraser Institute has done this for the last, let's say, 20 years or so. The red lines that you see in all these little multiple charts are the national numbers, and the blue lines are the provinces. Probably the most remarkable thing here is that all of these charts are going up, so it doesn't really matter what part of Canada you live in, the wait times have increased. And in particular, if you're looking out in Atlantic Canada, again in PEI, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, difficulties getting doctors and difficulties referring. But the variation across the system, which used to be relatively minor in, let's say, the 90s, is now quite significant. And the wait times are, let's say, 3 or 4 times in Atlantic Canada as they were in other areas. So that's changed in terms of the system. So these might not be specific and perfect measures of performance, but we can actually see that they've definitely degraded to some extent in terms of their variability. If we want to look at the education sector, one way to do that in the lower levels before post-secondary education, on slide 14, you'll see these PISA scores. So the OECD conducts the program for international student assessment. And what this does is try to assess 15-year-olds in terms of their ability to apply their knowledge and skills to real-world problems for science, for math, and for reading. I'm showing you here the one in math. I think we agree that math would be important. Same sort of story here. The red line is going down. The red is Canada's number. And we had seen that before. But again, if you dig into the provincial details, it's not like one province has done badly. It's essentially across the board. There's been slippage in terms of overall performance. Again, the lowest scores are happening in Atlantic for this measure. I will just show you on the higher education side, we look at graduation rates as a share of the local population for colleges and for universities. Here is the result for universities in slide 15. This is an area actually where an Atlantic province jumps out, and Nova Scotia does relatively well. They have a good university system with Dalhousie, St. FX, and some others. They are producing quite well in the university side. Ontario also doing well by this measure. And if you look kind of towards the bottom right of the chart, you'll see that Manitoba, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, whether we're in the university sector or in the college sector, they have been lagging behind other parts of the country. So this is just sort of a benchmarking exercise to show how things are doing. If you don't believe the levels, I think you kind of look at the trends over time and look at the dynamics. Finally, and I'm on my essentially last slide here, we can just ask people. Canadians in terms of their lived experiences and how they feel government services are doing for them. And the OECD allows you to put this in an international context. So they have a survey through their government at a glance, and they do this, I think, on an annual basis. This is the most recent data that we have, where they ask on a scale of 0 to 10, how satisfied are you with, let's say, the healthcare sector in your country as a whole? If the response is 5 or lower, that would be classified as dissatisfied. You're unhappy with the system. And if it's six and above, you're, quote, satisfied, and there's higher levels of satisfaction. But for Canada, they find that less than half of respondents in Canada are satisfied with the healthcare services that they receive. And if you look at the right-hand part of the slide here, Canada ranks 21st out of 30 countries in the OECD that have this survey. So we're not doing quite well in terms of international comparisons. And if you look at other things like person-centered care, sort of how people feel like they're being treated in the system, for those with chronic conditions, we're 17th of 17 countries that are measured. The story is not as bad on government services, but is a bit more middling. We're 13th out of 30 economies that are measured. But still, at this point, we have different surveys in Canada where the majority of people say that they can't really access services without some sort of assistance through the system. And some of the more important services to people that they care about and that they need, like immigration services, employment insurance, disability benefits, workers' compensation, those actually have the lowest customer sort of client satisfaction scores. So that's something that's interesting. I think there's been, to some extent, a growing frustration with complexity and inability to quickly serve people. And I will now wrap up on slide 17 by just giving you a couple of the highlights if I've gone through too quickly. The first on size, we've clearly seen a broad-based increase across Canada, across a lot of different indicators, a lot of different measures. That is being led by government spending. And on the activity side, increasing resources allocated to healthcare have been really driving the bus on the size activity measures. The second point on productivity, when we look at StatCan measures of output per worker or various comparisons between the business sector and the government sector, it's clear that the government sector has not kept pace over the last 15 or 20 years. It has been declining in terms of measured productivity. And when we compare this with some alternative measures, which we think may be a little bit more direct or a little bit better sense of what's happening to people on the ground, there's a lot of variation, but those are for the most part relatively disappointing as well. Finally, I point out that in Canada that we have 10 provinces, so we have a bit of a laboratory in terms of different tax rates, different spending settings, different local conditions. So it is possible to compare services, I think, at a government level and say who's doing this well, who's not doing this well, and try to benchmark that and push for reform and improvements across certain parts of the economy. So my last slide there is just to say that if you want to get a hold of me after the session, my contact information is there. With that, I guess we'll now turn to the panel.
Thank you, Stephen. I'd like to turn first to you and then to the panelists for a related question. But when it comes to the consistency you see across the board here in the provinces, on the one hand, we have a system of government wherein the provinces have a significant degree of autonomy and control, so one might expect to not see the same sort of trends. But as you say, with respect to size and government productivity relative to the private sector, fairly consistent. So why do you think that is?
Well, I would say this on the first observation, as going through these studies, doing this at the national level, looking at the provincial level, I was struck by just the persistence of these changes. So we have some rankings that will be coming out, the paper coming out next week. The rankings do move around a bit of your 10 provinces, but in general, on the size measures, we didn't see a lot of movement. It's not the case that any sector that had any province that had a large government had really moved to the small side or upside. So first observation just on the persistence of some of these differences. And then the second part where you look at kind of what's driving that. Again, I think it's hard to know as you interpret these data, what the right takeaway is. But I tried to show, at least on the productivity side, both these levels, these dynamics over time, and then comparisons in the business sector. I would say I was struck, like when I was at the Chamber of Commerce and I was chief economist there, and we would go around to local chambers and talk. If you're in a place like, let's say, Petawawa, where there's a large local employer that is driven by the government sector, I'm often told by people wages and compensation are higher in those areas. People have outside options. People can work for the government. People work for the business sector. So in some local communities where the government's a large employer, that may increase the costs of providing services in the business sector. That may make them less competitive outside. So I think there is something to the fact that there could be crowding out happening, or at least dynamics between rates of pay and rates of compensation, which are setting the mark. And a lot of those in the public sector are highly unionized, and they're on grids and scales. They don't change very much, whereas the private sector can be a bit more dynamic. But I think there is an interplay happening. I don't know that our data get at it all that well, but I do think there's sort of some channels there that we should look at.
Okay, very good. So I'd like to hear from you, Phil, Mike, and Tim about the differences. Like, why do some provinces get more value for money than others, and also a big idea that you bring to this discussion from your unique perspective. So I'll start with you, Phil.
Yeah. What I took most from this study by Stephen is not the differences between the provinces, but their similarities. The fact that productivity is down in all provinces. Remember that recently the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada, Caroline Rogers, declared that private sector productivity in this country was a, quote, break the glass emergency. What Stephen's data shows is that public sector productivity is doing even worse. So if the private sector is a break the glass emergency, I think that tells you just how severe, pervasive, and persistent is the problem in the public sector. And yet that's not discussed much. I mean, everybody talks about the the productivity crisis in this country in the private sector. There seems to be an increasing consensus and acknowledgement that we have to do something about it. And yet there hasn't been much discussion about this ongoing problem in the public sector. So hopefully Stephen's paper will help rectify that and start a discussion on it. I wouldn't get bogged down. I think it's important too that Stephen's documented that there's any number of different ways of looking at this, but they all point in the same direction. You can look at the Statistics Canada measure of public sector productivity, which is a new attempt by the organization. When I was there, we didn't try to measure it. I think it's a useful first step, and it helps getting people talking about this. I think you can look at specific measures, as Stephen did, with healthcare and education, where you can get closer to measuring specific outcomes. And again, you're getting the same result, and you're getting the same result across all provinces. And finally, there's the anecdotal or survey-based evidence that you cited from the OECD, which again shows that this is a pervasive problem. So that's what I took away from this is not that, yes, some of the larger provinces have certain advantages over smaller provinces, but what really stuck with me was how all of the data, all the indications for all levels of government are pointing in the same direction, that we have a break the glass productivity problem in the public sector, and we can get into why it's so pervasive and systemic in the government sector and what can be done about it.
Yeah, very good. Mike?
So I'm a practitioner, not a researcher in this. I think the work that Stephen and his colleagues have done is really good work, and it really drives at a key problem, as Phil described. I struggle as a practitioner, I struggle with the concept of this index of productivity. I don't know what a quality adjusted output and the pricing is for defense, right? But I do think it is getting at a core issue, and that I spent 35 years in the government of Canada, 34 years in the government of Canada, 1 year in a provincial government. And I think that in Canada, we're blessed with actually very good government that our governments work in the public interest much more so than almost any place in the world. But they have an efficiency problem. And that efficiency problem is eroding confidence in government. And it has a lot of ill effects. And that efficiency problem is serious, and I think it is solvable. The really interesting question is, why do we have this, and how do we solve this? And for me, the really compelling example, the really compelling metric comparing business sector productivity and public sector productivity, I find the indexes and the aggregate changes not compelling at all, because I don't know what they mean. Because government is a very different thing, and it doesn't trade with the public sector. There's no relative price. But when you look at the fundamental processes, there is a real problem. And I'll give you one example. Like when you get down to core processes, you can start comparing private sector and public sector productivity. And one of my favorite ones is access to information. It is wild how much governments are spending on access to information. They are spending a crazy amount of money. When I was a deputy minister of department, I had to reallocate money from frontline services to access to information. We did some work in government, and somebody came up with the cost of that we're spending all in about north of $10 a page releasing stuff on access to information. Access to information is more or less the same as legal discovery in the private sector. In the private sector, the cost of legal discovery has fallen by 90% because of digital and e-discovery tools. Digital tools have barely dented the cost of access to information. And there's a lot of core processes like that. When you dig down into them, it's like, wow, this is very inefficient. There's a way for this to be much better. Why isn't it? And then you have to get up to these bigger questions. In my time in government, I actually had the fortune or the misfortune of being shuffled into a department that was in a spending crisis when I went to Transport Canada. it had actually blown its vote. It came within millimeters of blowing its vote, which almost never happens. So there was a financial problem in the department. It was in financial crisis. It had to shrink the department by 25% in a year and a half. In 2016-17, managed to do that, and essentially we managed to improve some of our service delivery while shrinking our cost 25% because we had to, and there was no other choice, and the boats were, our iceberg was melting. And there is, if you focus your mind on it and you have no choice, there is a way to create systems in government that are more efficient. We've created an architecture around, and I'll come back to this maybe later, but we've created an architecture that is essentially almost prevents that. It's a political architecture, and it's a cultural architecture, and it's a management architecture, and that's where the game is getting at that. I might come back on a second round and talk about what I think that architecture is. But the point that I think is really important is that the cost of the weak productivity in government, and it is weak, and it is much lower than it should be and can be, is that citizens get less service, businesses get less service, confidence in government goes down. When citizens get less service, their quality of life goes down, and if you're calculating the cost properly, you should be adjusting for that. When businesses get less service, they can't do things. They can't create goods, services, and wealth. And I lived that through my time in government, and the last 10 years in government, I was a deputy minister in one of two departments. And I saw how our inability to organize ourselves and execute regulatory reviews, whether they're giant ones or small ones, was actually delaying projects. I worked a night and day on pushing through the regulatory process for one of the big LNG projects out west. And it took extreme measures and did all this stuff to try and overcome the structural inefficiencies and impediments and just time delays in our federal regulatory system. Finally managed to kind of get the federal government and the provincial governments to get a permit. Finally managed to sort out all the problems with the Indigenous kind of relations. So the whole thing was all permitted. The impact benefit agreements were all signed on the project. And that was all done it took probably about 3 years longer than it should have. And there was probably a couple of hundred regulatory conditions that weren't really needed, and they added several $1 billion to the project. And the proponent went to its JV board, and they wanted to build. There was a great opportunity. They went to the JV board and they said, "This is too late and too expensive," and the JV voted no, and they shut the project down. And so Canada should have. They have LNG Canada and Kitimat. They should have had PNW and Prince Rupert. PNW project was bigger, and it should be operating right now, and it wasn't. And not because it wasn't a good project, not because they weren't good proponents, because it took us literally 3 years too long, and we added billions to the cost of the project with conditions that were not really necessary. And I think that happened on a $50 billion scale there, but it happens thousands of times a year. So the cost of government inefficiency is quite significant. There's a really interesting attempt to get at that at the federal level right now. And I think it could pay great dividends. But there's a whole dimension to the cost that's beyond what Stephen has in his paper that I think we need to think about and focus our minds on solving. And I might come back later with a couple of ideas.
Right, Tim?
Okay. I mean, I think I would like to focus on levels versus rates of change. It's not a surprise that the level of productivity in government is less than in the private sector, because governments are in different businesses. They have all kinds of constraints that the private sector doesn't have. They often have to worry a lot about how they do things, not just the output. And it's not a surprise that productivity levels will be different across provinces. If you look across countries, there are huge differences in productivity, and these are a result of deep differences in geography, but in culture, in resource endowment, all kinds of things. And those are very difficult to change. You know, if you look at the ranking of provinces by productivity 50 years ago, it's not that different from what it is now. You have Alberta, BC, quite high, the Atlantic provinces at the bottom, Ontario sort of in the upper middle, and I'm sure in 50 years' time it'll be very similar. And you see that in governments. I've certainly found the Alberta government is usually pretty innovative, and then there are other governments that I won't name that are much less so. So it's not a surprise that we have these level differences, and they're very, they're going to be very difficult to eliminate. I don't think we're going to be, however much work people in government put into it, I don't think you can see the government as efficient as the private sector in everything that it does. But I think what is more troubling, and what we see in Stephen's work, is a difference in the rates of change. So the private sector getting more efficient, perhaps not as quickly as we would like, but certainly if you look over the 10 and 20 years, there have been very significant gains in the efficiency in the private sector. And we're just not seeing that in the public sector. In fact, we're seeing it go in the other direction. And some provinces have done a bit better than others, but you still overall see this kind of widening gap between the private sector's ability to produce goods and services and the government's ability, and that's just not sustainable. It's certainly not sustainable in a world in which the government is essentially the monopoly supplier of healthcare, largely the monopoly supplier of education. Societies get richer, they want, and get older, we want more healthcare. We may not need quite as much education. But because we have these systems that are financed through taxes, if we want more and more, and the systems themselves are getting less efficient, we're going to have to devote more and more tax dollars to that. And I suspect that's just not going to be efficient. That's just not going to be politically sustainable. So I think the question for governments is how they turn that gap around. And I think the good news, and Mike alluded to a bit of it, is there's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there. There's a lot of things that governments are doing that they do just because they've always done it, processes that have just been in place because no one has really questioned them. Every so often cost-cutting exercises come around, but often those are they have a short-term focus, or they don't really get deep into what government actually does. But that's certainly, I think, going to be a huge challenge going forward.
Okay, excellent stage setting here. So I want to follow up on a couple of things. Mike, you were kind of pointing the question, like, what does productivity actually tell us, especially in these government sectors wherein the outputs and outcomes may be a little more intangible, like in defense? So that question, what to expect from government given this fundamentally different structure and incentives from the private sector, I think is really illuminating. Stephen, in your first or second paper, you did show that private and government sector productivity was more closely aligned in the 90s, so not to say that it can't be more closely aligned in the future, but there are a lot of things militating against that reality, perhaps. So what can we really expect from government sector productivity? So I'd like to hear from anyone who'd like to take those two questions, like what does productivity really tell us, and what can we really realistically expect from government in terms of public sector productivity? Not all at once.
I think, well, let's say two things. On the comparison, there's points made about public sector productivity is worse than private sector productivity. I'm completely underwhelmed by that. I just don't know how to compare them because I think they're different. They produce different things. If you can tell me what the relative price is between the product that the public sector puts out in the private sector, then maybe. But I actually think that I look at it differently. It's not that we have that the private sector is much more productive than the public sector. It's that the public sector is much less productive than it can be, and much less productive than it should be to provide good government to Canadians and all the things that go from that. So, but I probably shouldn't get into a methodological fight with some people who know a lot more about the methodology than I do. I do think it is fixable because it's the principle. There's a principle in management. You have to essentially if you care about it, and if you manage to it, you can get it. It's kind of that simple. And I think the problem here is essentially the intersection of the sort of critique of Donald Savoy and Ezra Klein. And honest to God, I think if you read the last few books of Donald Savoy and you read Abundance, the sum of those problems is what is driving down productivity, is that we built a society and a system of government where we care about process, not about outcomes. Where we've built a default of no, and that we've decided that how we do something is more important than what we do, and we've built a political system where the gains and the losses come from the ability to spark outrage, and so you've created a culture of a extremely risk-averse culture, and that because of the media cycles and everything else, we've been more and more focused on communications and engagement. As Donald Savoy says, we're hiring all poets and not plumbers, and we built there's a political system. There's a parliamentary accountability system that's broken. There's an auditor general that basically is there's an auditor general kind of system in this town where, as they're great people and they do great work, but basically they've created almost a perfect machine for growth in accountability, not results, but growth and accountability. And so what happens is the people who run stuff, they respond to all this, right? I mean, when Tim and I were deputy ministers for a long time, some of the most talented, hardworking people, smartest people on the face of the earth, they're running large organizations. I ran one of 6,000 people. That was kind of average. And that we're under intense pressure to deliver on 12 things. The actual efficiency of our operation is sort of at the bottom of that list, because the political system, the societal system, and the political system, they don't care. So fundamentally, we're getting inefficient government because people don't actually care about efficient government. I spent 20 years going to parliamentary committees. I've answered every question under the face of the sun. I can't remember a serious question about the efficiency of any service I was responsible for. I know lots of gotcha questions, and that it worked around. I had an experiment at Transport Canada where, out of a sheer necessity, it drove a 25 to 30% improvement in the efficiency of the operation. Some of our back office functions, we managed to cut them. We managed to cut the unit cost by 90%, 90, because we had to, and that was like, people were like, yeah, that's kind of cool, but it was never wow, we've got to replicate this, because of all the things that you have to respond to, and all of the things that ministers are under pressure for, and prime ministers and governments, like nobody really cares about that. They care about whether you followed a process. So like, there is a way to fix this. There's an ability to fix this. But you have to change the political architecture. You have to change how you manage in the system and the public service managers, but that will never change until the political and the public architecture above it changes.
Yeah, maybe I'll just violently agree with that, since my experiences were the same. Particularly at the federal level, it's not set up to produce outputs. It's set up to produce policy. And policy is what senior public servants think that they do. That's what ministers think about. That's what the public discourse is about. The federal government's, there's a fair amount of service delivery it does, but unlike the provinces, it's not what drives what drives a conversation, what drives promotion, what drives the kind of people that they look for at a senior level. And as Mike says, there's just no interest in efficiency. Every so often there's a cost-cutting exercise, and being able to manage within your budget, not in Ottawa speak blowing your vote, is very important. But again, that's one of these process things. It's a box to be ticked. There's nothing that year in, year out is there to drive you to more efficient outcomes. And yes, measurements are challenging government, but there's a lot of things that you can measure. ATIP's a good example. There's all kinds of things, HR processes, how much fixed costs, how much administrative overhead you have. You could be comparing to the provinces, provincial governments. You could be comparing to other
You can
national
compare
governments.
those to the private sector.
Yeah, well, exactly. So there's a lot that could be done, but nobody, when I was a deputy minister, nobody asked me about that. Part of the problem, I think, is that firstly, we have an audit culture that very much grew really big after the sponsorship scandal, which of course essentially brought down a government. But auditors are not economists. Auditors are there to see, did you follow the rules? Did you tick the boxes? It's a very important function, but it's not the same thing at all as do you get value for money? Departments all have audit and evaluation shops, but the people in those shops doing evaluation, again, are auditors. The way they evaluate, again, is not to what are the outcomes, what are the costs you incur to achieve those outcomes. And if you look at the central agencies, Treasury Board, Finance, where Mike and I both worked at one point, Privy Council Office where I worked, the system is generally set up to look at the flow of new money and to police the flow of new money. It's not set up to look at your entire budget and how you're spending your current money. The view is generally once you have the money and it's in your budget, it's kind of yours as a department. And nobody in central agencies spends a lot of time thinking about how you spend that money. It's all about gatekeeping the new money, and that's how Finance and Treasury Board essentially control spending. But it doesn't help you on the efficiency side.
I'd like to ask my own question is, I agree with everything you two have said. My problem is that applies as much to the civil service in the 80s and 90s as it does today, to process-oriented, not oriented outcome.
No, it doesn't.
Not policy. My question is, what happened over the last 10 years? In your graphs, there's particularly been a sharp drop in productivity, public sector productivity over the last 10 years at both the federal and provincial levels. My question is, what is it that systemically within government has been pushing down productivity, specifically over the last 10 years?
So, sorry, Phil, I didn't mean to jump in so quickly. No, it's not the same. It's actually governing and running government now, and the environment for the public service is very different than it was in the 80s and 90s. And it goes back to, I would go back to the Savoie critique, is that we've seen this explosive growth in focus on process, explosive growth in the focus on sort of engagement, political coordination, and communication. And so if you look at like the Prime Minister's office, central agencies, they are monstrous today compared to where they were in the 80s. And so what's happened is the top of the system is focused on, there's almost, if you're trying to get something done in government, right, like to kind of get a policy, to implement something, to make a difference, you actually have to navigate the official decision-making system and the parallel decision-making system. And the parallel decision-making system doubles or triples the time and effort required. And that system is like, I'd say, 4 times bigger today than it was in the 80s and 90s. And it's a reflection of the fact that, and it's a whole bunch of stuff, we've become a society more focused on process and outcome. We've had a series, and we've had this perfect kind of, this endless ratcheting up of oversight, accountability, review. One of the hardest things to do in government is when you get an Auditor General's report and the Auditor General, like, they do good work and they're meaningful and but they have an audit culture. It's a risk-averse culture. So they have 18 recommendations for all these extra steps and processes that you should do before you do anything. And one of the hardest things to do in any government is convince a minister we have to disagree with the Auditor General. Like, it happens, but it's rare and it's difficult. And so there's this endless increase in process coordination and parallel decision-making that happens at the federal and provincial level. So it's a very different beast than it used to be.
Well, I don't know
and
if
as a
that's-
result,
yeah.
it's a much less efficient beast because it's harder to get stuff done. There's more processes to get an actual thing that makes a difference for a citizen or a business today than there was 10 years ago, and there's more than the 10 years before that.
Okay, I don't know if it's radically different, though. I mean, these
It
problems
is.
of centralization and process over outcome, I mean, those problems were problems in the 80s and 90s. You're just saying they've become worse. I'm asking, is there something else that's been injected over the last 10 years, such as increasing emphasis on diversity, equity, inclusion policies, for example? I know, talking to my colleagues at Statistics Canada, the latest complaint, and I can't see this ever helping productivity, is what Kevin Lynch and James Mitchell in their latest book called hoteling. Employees are expected to come up. They no longer have an office. You show up with your laptop. You plug into at some anonymous desk. There's no personal effects. It changes every day. And we're asking these employees to become more productive. It's not going to work.
So you've thrown out two things, and they're both controversial things. They have different sides to them. They have some pluses and minuses, but in the grand scheme of things, both of those are irrelevant. That's just my view, though.
I mean, I would say over the last 10 years, what we've seen is we've seen a very big expansion in the size of the federal government. Almost 40% increase in headcount. And I think that's one of the differences. I mean, certainly through the 90s, you'd had the big cuts in 95, and then it made departments a lot more, not necessarily productivity conscious, but certainly more cost conscious. And with the Harper government, the various expenditure reduction exercises they have, that sort of kept going. But then the spending taps were really turned on, and we were adding headcount like crazy. And I think it's fair to say that those people who were added were not necessarily producing. Adding. We increased by 40%. We certainly didn't increase our output by 40%. And it's hard to drive efficiency in government, probably true in the private sector as well, in an environment where resources are increasing quite rapidly. It's very much more about how we're going to spend this money as opposed to how do we cut our costs. So I would say that's the biggest thing. I do think that the layering on of diversity objectives, sustainability objectives, other objectives, certainly didn't help. We've seen HR departments grow significantly. And to Mike's point, the bits of government that produce rules have gotten bigger, and their job is to produce rules. And they have produced more and more rules.
I'm going to jump in, though. I think I agree with your assessment, Tim, but I think it is a very attractive and I think politically sort of delightful thing to kind of go taxate. This is because of DEI. DEI has caused all this. I think that's a real mistake. I think it's a cheap shot, but more importantly, it's a distraction because it's not like DEI. It's not because we cared about sustainability. It's not because we cared about DEI. It's a much and you can have it. We could have a panel on whether DEI is good or bad. The point is, trying to blame stuff like that for this problem is basically condemning us to failure because that's not the problem. The problem is a culture is a much bigger thing where we've gone from focusing on outcomes to process. We built an enormous political superstructure that's about politics, that's about engagement, messaging, spinning. And this dynamic, I've had the privilege and the honor of serving under like 5 prime ministers, I think. I was a senior public servant. In fact, I was appointed to different deputy minister positions under Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau. Very different prime ministers, very different approaches to all sorts of political things. The political view, whether you were whether you were a climate warrior on the other side or pro or anti-DI, none of that mattered. It was all didn't matter where you came from on the political spectrum. this problem has been ratcheting up for years. I experienced this trying to do some reforms, some efficiency, structural reforms for efficiency under the Harper government, under the Trudeau government. Both of them were really, really hard to do. Now, under the Harper government, they ran a deficit reduction exercise, and as Tim pointed out, when you reduce spending, you find that you can be more productive. And I think we're going to see some gains in productivity now, because there's some very hopeful things that the Carney government's doing. They're reducing operational spending. They're making a big penchant at reducing sort of executives and managers and delayering. Plus, but one of the most positive things they're doing is they're putting a lot of pressure on the government to do more faster. So they're squeezing productivity from both sides. They're taking out some of the resources. They're putting a lot of pressure, like to do regulatory reviews in 2 years. It's a fantastic thing that will make a big difference. That will force management changes on the regulatory process that have been long overdue and have been the big problem. And when Stephen Harper the Harper government, they tried to fix the regulatory process, they brought in massive legislative change. Nobody bothered trying to change how the reviews are managed. And as a result, all of those reforms in the Harper era, nothing improved. I think with no legislative changes, the prospect of getting a dramatic improvement in the regulatory system is quite good, because the current Prime Minister has said, we're cutting the resources and we're demanding you get the thing done in 2 years. I think we're going to see a productivity improvement that was not possible, that has never happened before, even under a government that was trying to speed up reviews.
I want to pick up on that briefly, because yes, they are certainly indicated they're going to reduce the size of government, HR and spending. They've also, I believe, carved out from that exercise, it's a question for you, Tim, the equalization and transfer portion of spending, which is, I think, over 50%, around 50%, something like that. So how much should we expect from these latest attempts to reduce size, make government more efficient?
I mean, there's a provincial and federal component to this. So, I mean, what the federal government is doing now is it's looking at its own spending, particularly operational spending. So, it's the government, the money the government spends directly on wages, salaries, capital, etc., delivering its own programs. There's a portion of what government does, though, which is writing checks for other people. And a big part of that is transfers to persons, so pensions, etc. But an important chunk as well is transfers to provinces. Part of that's equalization. There's a chunk of that is for health and other social services. And one question around this is the federal government helping or hurting provincial attempts to make provincial delivery of services like healthcare and education more efficient? And of course, when the federal government's picking up a big part of the tab, there's obviously just less incentive for provinces to get to grips with some of the inefficiencies in their own systems. And one of the challenges that the provinces have is healthcare, education. These are very, very unionized. There's a lot of interests there that seek to impede change, and you often get in this dynamic where provinces will privately say to the federal government, please don't bail us out on healthcare, because our politicians need to stiffen our spines and stand up to the doctors' unions and the nurses' unions. But then when push comes to shove, the provincial governments are just putting up too much pressure for the federal government to give them more money, and the federal government caves. And we've seen that time and again in Canada. And so you just get this blurring of accountabilities. Nobody's really sure, is it the federal government's job? Is it the province's job to make healthcare better? Everyone's pointing fingers at each other, and we just end up with systems that are just not as efficient as if they would be in a world where there's just kind of very, very clear accountability for a given level of government for a given problem. For defense, we know who's in charge of defense, and we know whom to blame for the parlous state of our defense sector. But certainly for higher education, K-12 less so, much less so, and healthcare, it's just very blurry for the average Canadian. And as the federal government's now got into childcare, gone into dental care, again, it's getting even more blurry about where does the accountability for poor results lie.
Good point. Okay, let's come back to the provinces now. Stephen, so through your studies, you show that the maritime provinces appear more productive, but that's only relative really to weak business sectors. And then you've got a different dynamic in some of the larger provinces. So when it comes to metrics to tell an important story about the productivity question nationally, should we be looking to benchmarks, or how do you think we should measure and tell the story properly about the different productivity circumstances across the country?
Yeah, well, so I take Michael's point as given sort of the caveats for if you're looking just taking StatCan data as given and saying, well, we're just adding up inputs. I think those are valid points and things we should be concerned about. But I don't think that the takeaway is therefore we throw our hands up and say, well, we can't learn anything about the sector, therefore we can't measure, therefore we don't talk. I think, in fact, the opposite is, okay, well, now let's dig in and let's have some specialists. Let's say there's a Council of Federation that gets together and they actually sit down and say, at the provincial level, it's hard to measure outcomes in education, but we could dedicate some resources and we could have some people that would look at this. Because we started in education just looking at test scores. There were some comments of, well, why don't we look at outcomes on graduation and in terms of how long it takes people to graduate, what they're getting when they come out. There's a whole number of different measures. I think the first point I would make on that is just you shouldn't, in terms of a key performance indicator, just pick one thing. I think you should look system-wide. And because you don't want some province or somebody to be able to game the system and say, I'm only going to sort of train to this particular metric. But if you have a lot of different metrics and you bring them together in some meaningful way in a forum, and I've just found in my research often having these lists and comparisons is useful because everybody wants to be at the top of the list, nobody wants to be at the bottom of the list. So yes, measurement's hard, but that I think therefore means we've got to try harder to measure. And then the process focus that we talked about before, where we're not really talking about outcomes, we're looking at how did the government check the box and the thing. Then that's what I like towards the end of the paper is, well, then why don't we just ask people how they're experiencing the services that they're getting from government? And that's not really, that's a sort of just a different way at the question to say, well, what are people thinking about how the healthcare system's working, the education system's working? If they're not happy, what are they not happy about? And if you report some of those metrics on an annual basis, then maybe when you're in front of Parliament, they'll be asking you different questions.
Okay. So let's drill down a little bit into the different sectors. So healthcare is the biggest driver in increased government spending. We have an aging society. That's certainly part of the dynamic there. It's also been somewhat of a untouchable third rail political issue in Canada to make any structural reforms to how healthcare is delivered. We have basically a rationing system. And so this, I think, gets at the question of how much of this is structural, mechanics and government culture versus cultural issues in each domain. So you've got these particular set of issues in healthcare where, politics and aging society may be driving some of it. In education, I think you've got, I would point to, and in post-secondary, this kind of culture where we're focused more on social outcomes rather than skills acquisition, character development, the pursuit of truth, and you have an expansion, and it is documented in some of the figures that we're spending more on non-academic salaries now. So there's definitely an increase in this kind of administrative structure that is about DEI, is about safetyism and kind of accommodations and this sort of thing. So I guess my question to anyone who would dare answer some of these politically contentious questions, how much of the issues that we're seeing in healthcare, K-12 or post-secondary, are driven by these broader social cultural issues, or just the kind of structure machinery of government issues that we're seeing across the board? Mike, you want to take this one, I know it.
I'll make 3 points because I know I'm coming in hot here. The first is that this work that Stephen and colleagues and the MLI has done is really important work. And it's, you know, you can quibble about the index, but it's really important work because it's put data and structure and facts around a really serious, like probably the most serious problem in the public space in Canada. The second is that it sets us up to go to the next question, which is start to tease through, well, like, what are the underlying causes for the deterioration and how do we turn them around, which is kind of your question. Mm-hmm. And I think just generally, I would encourage, I don't know what the plans are, but to keep work to get to put some energy into a next step on this project, because I think it's very promising. And I actually think there's a set of answers that will tap into some of the big issues, and you can come up with practical suggestions and advice, and you can come up with a playbook that will work across different government sectors. I think the issue, to my mind, again, and you know, people like to say it's because we care too much about DI or sustainability, but I think the bigger issue, and it's in education, it's in a lot of things, is the back office is eating the front office, right? In that whatever the function we're doing, whatever the public outcome or good we're doing, we've allowed process and we've allowed special interests and stakeholders, including the people in the system, to basically have their interest trump the actual delivery of the public good. And so you see this, in school, K-12 and PSE, you see it in healthcare, you see it everywhere where, holy crap, the total workforce that's actually delivering a service is now a minor, is less than 50%. It's just crazy, right? Yeah. And you see it in government. Like we have massive back offices that are very wasteful and very inefficient, and it's a whole bunch of people invented processes. Some of them came from an AG audit, some of them came from some busybody at Treasury Board, some of them have a DEI element, but calling it a DEI problem is wrong. Calling it a sustainability problem is wrong. It's actually a systemic focus on process and a willingness to spend endless amounts on process, not results. So you have to kind of get at that underlying level, and you'll do a whole, and then you'll be blowing up a whole bunch of stuff. You may, like in a process, like there may be an equity advisor you don't need. But for every equity advisor you don't need, there's 87 other advisors and other process people who are not required. And like, don't focus on the one and forget the other 89. That's why I react very negatively to saying it's DEI or it's sustainability. It's not that. It's a much bigger game.
Well, I think that's a good point. It's a fair point that, you know, really maybe those specific areas are applications of a very large, you know, administrative HR contingent looking for things to do. And I would say maybe too many post-secondary graduates as well. But
I'll give you an example on a thing where we reduced our back office on a program, a major program. Actually, it was interesting enough, it was the delivery of the zero emission vehicles incentive payment. You can love that or hate it, and people have and there's lots of people that line up on both sides. But the interesting thing is that we went and we used a digital transformation of that thing, and we reduced our back office costs by 90%, 90. If we focused on, that was not an ideological thing, right? Because you have a program that Parliament, you know, voted for, good or bad, you can like it or hate it. We took out the back office by 90%. That's what you need to focus on, right? And then, and I think that opportunity exists. And I think Tim's point about the money dynamic is exactly right, is that we tend to fix these things with more money. Yeah. We should be fixing them with less process.
But Michael, that's also the other point about the perverse incentives where you have fixed A-based funding and other things. So let's say you do reduce your costs by 90%. You go back next year, you're going to be given a lower budget. And most people working in government want to increase their resources, increase their reach. So going to tell a story that you've done well is good, but in some sense, it actually reduces your power in the overall system in Ottawa.
Which is why
Right?
the
So-
political accountability parliamentary infrastructure's got to flip on its
Yeah.
head, right?
To
Which
see
is
that
why
as,
you
a,
have-
as a
you
good
have-
thing as opposed to a bad thing.
And, well, you
Okay.
have to see it as, I think it was seen as a good thing because we were out of money.
Yeah.
But I think it goes back to the, if of all of these trends that you've so accurately assessed, I think in the cold light of day, my guess is the declining productivity of the federal administration in the last 10 years will be the starkest and the worst part, right?
That was at least in the second report in terms of the increase in the footprint of just
Yeah.
actual employment.
Yeah.
It was about 110,000 at the peak from
Yeah.
2015. But yes, the increase in federal employment was significant. And again, you can quibble with the outputs, however you want to
can,
say. But
but-
do you think that we've seen a 40% increase in whatever output Ottawa
that's
producing?
exactly it. Like I think
Yeah.
a reasonable estimate of the productivity delta is somewhere between -20 and -40%. Would be my personal take. I think it's hard to measure, but that's one where the system was cursed by a money tap that was turned on full, right? When I was sort of running through that as deputy minister, we did a lot of really good things, and there's a lot of stuff that I'm very proud of that has made a positive difference, that's changed the country. But at one point, my biggest problem was spending the money fast enough, right? And how on earth am I going to actually be able to kind of spend this money fast enough that's coming in? The purpose it's coming in for is really good. The results we got were pretty good, but when you're racing to spend money as fast as you can, you don't generate the best productivity.
Yeah. Oh, what a nice problem to have. Right?
Yeah. Now, happily, that problem's gone away.
Yeah. Phil, you want to make a comment? Then I'm just going to say we're going to do quick questions for you, Tim, Phil, and Mike, and then audience questions. So.
A couple points. One is we have an interesting experiment in the importance of DEI going on in the U.S., where the current administration is basically abolishing it inside the federal government. We'll see what is the impact on productivity there. The other point I'd make, though, is yes, I agree there's been a very sharp drop in productivity over the last 3 or 4 years because of the excessive spending. So I think it'll be very easy for the government to make up some productivity gains over the next 2 years. The federal government has shown in the past, in '95 under Chrétien, your experience in transport with a 25% cut. Statistics Canada regularly goes through large decreases. It always boosts productivity in the short term. The federal government can deal with these types of cuts in the short term. The problem is that after 5, 10 years, you revert back to the trend that you were always on. It's how do you make these changes in efficiency last? And that's where I think there's a culture problem.
Okay, great. So Tim, question for you about trade. So how much does provincial regulatory and administrative efficiency affect our trade performance overall? Does the regulatory glut we have, slow approvals, provincial trade barriers, reduce our competitiveness abroad? And on the federal, provincial, territorial level, do those structures meaningfully support joint productivity agendas, or do you think they could be going forward?
I mean, it's pretty well documented that there are a whole series of interprovincial trade barriers that stem from different regulatory systems, as well as potentially excessive regulation in a whole series of areas. And it makes sense if you're trying to produce a product and you have to harmonize. You have to think about 10 different regulatory, 10 different building codes, let's say, or other regulatory codes. That's going to introduce costs, and then, as a country, that reduces our ability to export, because we can't even have free trade within Canada. Trying to deal with those barriers within the country, and then having to deal with all of the things you need to do to export to another country, and deal with U.S. regulatory standards, let's say, or European regulatory standards. I mean, when you talk to companies, these are very real costs for them when they're thinking about where they, what they want to produce and where they want to export. And one of the challenges underlying that is you get these government organizations, regulatory authorities who, very well intentioned, and but their job is to make and enforce rules, and that's what they're going to do. And one of the reasons for all of these different regulations across the country, and the fact that we don't have harmonized regulations, is that the incentive for each regulatory body is to say my rules are the best, because they're not going to say my rules are not the best. Jim over there in the other province has better rules, because they're basically talking themselves out of a job.
And they don't care about the difference.
No, well, exactly. Like in some ways, the difference is that, well, let's say Alberta, we're different. We have higher standards than those barbarians in Saskatchewan, let's say. And then in Saskatchewan, they say, well, the Albertans are already too fussy, and they shouldn't be demanding, this level of regulation. And so that's why it's been very, very hard to harmonize regulations, because you get 10 regulators around a table, they're all going to argue for their own. And one of the things of the promising things about the way I think the federal government and a number of provinces are going after this now is, the best way forward there is mutual recognition. And you say, well, if something's good enough for Saskatchewan, then it's good enough for Alberta. And the regulatory folks will often find that a bit threatening, because they could essentially be out of a job. If you're a smaller province, PEI, you say, well, why do we bother having all these regulators? We can just use somebody else's standards and just essentially free ride off other people's regulatory systems. We could do that as a country. We could free ride. Drugs is a good example. If a drug has been approved in, I would say, 2 of US, UK, Australia, EU, Switzerland, then it should be approved here. The Canadians' bodies are no different from those in other countries. But we have a big regulatory system set up in the name of, I guess, Canadian nationalism to approve all of these drugs that have already been through regulatory processes in other countries. Now, that's not to say you get rid of it entirely. You could see a world in which we specialize in certain kinds of drugs and have a very fast regulatory approval, and that may be a reason for drug companies to set up here. But certainly, regulators are concerned for their own job security. They are, naturally assume that their regulations are the best, and they also don't see themselves as part of their province or the country's competitiveness strategy. That's not how they think at all. They don't think about, well, how can we make businesses like a drug company want to come to Canada because we have a more efficient regulatory process. That's not how they're paid. That's not how they evaluate, they measure their own performance.
Can I jump in? So just to connect what Phil and Tim said, it is a challenge, Phil, you're right. Like, we've got these episodic improvements. How do you make them structural? Like, that is a big question. I think there's a couple of things that Carney government's doing that I think are interestingly promising. One is the whole federal provincial, the regulatory cooperation thing. There's a dynamic that's been unleashed, as Tim described, that is going to get us to some structural, less friction across the country. The second is that you said we're going to build faster, and federal regulatory approvals are 2 years. That's a crazy acceleration. You spend money and time, they're co-production. Like this inefficient machine is wasting money and time. It's going to force that in, and at the same time we're reducing operational spending in government. Some giant forces have been unleashed by the current government that have some potential to generate structural improvements over time. There's a couple of missing pieces inside the machine, and there's a question of what happens down the road. But there are some structural forces that have recently been unleashed that I think have us headed in a good direction.
Very good. So 2 final questions, very brief responses, please, and we'll go to audience. One for you, Phil. From a macro perspective, what are the major bottlenecks impeding Canada's overall productivity improvements that you would highlight? And then Mike, from your time at Transportation and Natural Resource Canada, what are the best types of infrastructure that are productivity enhancing? And then how do we improve the situation you were alluding to there with respect to the approvals of major products and pipelines, what have you, and how does that contribute to productivity?
I wish I had brought my favorite graph, which was in the Financial Post this summer. It shows business investment in the United States and Canada, and basically it does this. We've been declining for steadily over the last 10 years while the US has been accelerating. Inevitably, a gap like that, it's a 50% gap in investment rates between the two countries, that has to show up in productivity. So I think that's the number one problem, and government's a big part of that. I remember talking to Christie, the former Premier of BC, a few years ago, and asked, where did the LNG ideas come from? And she said, oh, when we arrived in government, we asked civil service, you know, any ideas like that? And somebody said, oh yeah, we had some proposals for some LNG plants, and that just goes back to show how the civil service can impact overall productivity. It also goes to your point about how difficult it is to measure. How do you calculate a decision like that, and how do you attribute that to increased output in the civil service? I don't know, and that's why, in some sense, the civil service has to be responsible for these global indicators, like GDP, like business investment.
Great point.
But I think the civil service has to be focused on how do we get business investment growing in this country again. A lot of that comes back to regulation, and a lot to is culture and attitudes.
Great, thank you. Mike, final from you on infrastructure and projects.
I think that in Mike's, the culture and attitudes part of Phil, I just completely agree with that. On infrastructure, I think that it has Canada is living the Ezra Klein problem. It is wickedly hard to build anything in this country. It is brutally hard. In fact, it's cheaper and faster to build a big thing in Europe than Canada, and like, how do we get there, right? A big part of it is the federal provincial thing, and then a regulatory system that has run amok. Less in the law. I actually think that the problems in the laws around regulatory standards and reviews, there's a couple of serious ones, but it's all process. And it's because inside the heart of government, we've decided that we have a culture of no, and if we're not sure, we make infrastructure builders do all sorts of stuff that we don't know is necessary because we assume we basically assume it's zero cost, and it's not. And so fixing that is everything. I do believe the forces underway in this Build Canada agenda in 24 months to permitting is going to have an enormous positive change in the country.
Fantastic. So let's go to audience questions now. Beth, my colleague Beth has the mic. This fellow here.
I'd like to go to the root of the question. Education is the most important factor here. Education has several goals, but the most important goal in education is to move a person from fear to freedom. And it does that by raising the consciousness of the individual to such a point where that individual willingly takes the internal stand to be totally responsible for everyone and everything in the community in which he or she lives. A community could be as small as a person or as vast as the entire universe. We are not creating citizens. We are creating subjects. A citizen is one who takes responsibility for everyone in the community. And I ask you, what is our education system doing? A university is supposed to unite unity with diversity. Universities today have changed diversity into adversity and confrontation, and they haven't been checked. I don't know what caused that, and why did we stand idly by to watch our university become basically institutions that are ruining the country. I wonder, what can we do? This problem is not going to be solved overnight, no matter how many rules and regulations you introduce, until such time as the individual takes that personal responsibility. We are done.
That's a great question. We're going to take one more. I think lady over here had one. Beth?
Thank you. I'm wondering if any of you have comments on the charts that show the declining productivity in healthcare and education, and if there's any reflection on immigration levels in the last, say, 10 years.
Okay, great. So the state of our education in terms of its objectives and immigration's connection to productivity.
Well, maybe I'll start off on education, or at least higher education. I mean, I do think we have overbuilt our education systems, and they've very much become partly machines for generating credentials that people can then kind of take to the white-collar labor market. But there's a big debate in the economics about to what extent is higher education, particularly, does it actually generate real human capital, or is it just a selection mechanism? Is it just a signaling mechanism? And obviously there are elements of both, and in different programs, if you're learning, you're doing a medical degree, then I'm sure a lot of what you learn you will actually use. But if you're doing philosophy or something like that, maybe that's a little less so. And I think a lot of the evidence is on certainly the level now that we've got to where people are in university for like half of their 20s is very much a signaling world. And that is inefficient because all the signaling doing is it's sorting people out into essentially more or less intelligent and as a signal for the labor market. But you could do that, you could probably do that, you could do the high school level. But of course, what's happening is there's a rat race going on where people are staying longer and longer because they want to have better credentials than the average. And everybody's kind of trying to do that. So our university systems are in large part geared to that, but they have also grown fat on immigration, and immigration's temporary, students, foreign students coming in, not just because they want to study, but because they expect to then be able to stay permanently. The universities have done very well off that over the last 5-10 years. That's changing now a lot. But you see that in the UK and the US. And a lot of that rent that largesse has been used to build up university administration, but also allow a lot of kind of luxury teaching of things that are not necessarily particularly useful for society, or at least citizens would not necessarily view that. And so I do think that model is coming under a lot of stress now. We're seeing a significant reduction in foreign students, and I think we're starting to see employers as well say, well, everybody now has a university degree. I'm going to maybe start selecting on using different criteria. Maybe a degree is not as useful as I thought, and I think we're seeing young people as well start to question whether they're really getting the benefit from that. So I do think that higher education, not just in Canada but across the Western world, is having to ask itself some hard questions about what is it really there for, and what is the real value that it adds.
Any further comments about education or immigration on productivity?
John, the immigration question, it's a good question. We didn't bring in immigration data into the lens to look at the analysis, so I couldn't really comment on that, but it's definitely something we could look into for future work.
I would think it's not going to have much of an impact on healthcare. I think normally in an industry when you see substantially higher demand, it's easier to grow productivity. I think it's probably much more likely that immigration had a negative impact on productivity in the education sector. We brought in particular, a number of temporary foreign students who were much more interested in working than in studying.
Great points.
Yeah, it was a ghost temporary foreign workers program more than anything else.
So we've got time for, let's take 2 or 3 more questions. Okay, great. Yep.
How are you guys? Yeah, so I have a question. We're talking about productivity, okay? And as you guys know, recently the Bank of Canada held its rates. One of the biggest parts of our economy here in Canada is the housing, okay? Which has had trouble, especially real estate, with the interest rates being so high for years. And one of the big things is the spin-offs of real estate and all the industries. So I want to know how the interest rates being held where they are could help productivity in Canada.
Okay, great. That's one question. And a lady over there, Beth, and then is there any others? Okay, and Mr. Shake.
Hi, thank you. Really appreciated this, and I find your reports quite interesting. I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit, or I'd love to hear some views from some of the panelists on how they think AI could have an impact on productivity, specifically in the federal governments moving forward. Thank you.
Okay. Now, last question, Beth, for Munir over here. Munir, maybe you just speak up loudly. Okay, no, that's that's very fast.
It's almost.
Well, since productivity is output over labor, and in the case of government, G over L, my question is whether there's a risk that in a period of strong growth in government spending, and G is mostly the cost of labor in the government, is there a risk that whatever, however bad the numbers are, that they're even worse than what the data would show?
Okay, very good. Those 3 questions.
All right, I'll start with the interest rate one. It's definitely been housing affordability has reduced productivity because it has discouraged people from moving in to our most productive cities, Vancouver and Toronto. I would look at it the other way around. I think higher interest rates were designed to ultimately bring down housing prices and restore housing affordability. So I don't see that high interest rates are actually, we're aggravating that problem. They're designed in the longer term to increase housing affordability and allow people to move back into our most productive cities. So I think there's a short-term versus a long-term way of looking at this.
Two quick things on just interest rates, but on housing. I was doing some reading on around productivity in preparation for this and some other things, and I was stunned to find that productivity in the construction sector in Canada is on a secular decline. It's negative. I was like,
It hasn't increased in 20 some odd years.
It's actually gone down a bit.
Yeah.
And I'm like, holy jeez. And actually, you guys may have a view as to why that is. It strikes me that one of the government's partly to blame, because if you whatever you're constructing, whether it's big or small, you need permits. And the slow speed of getting the permits, I think, may have something to do with that. But we have more people in construction than manufacturing, and we have negative productivity growth in construction. And it goes to your point, Phil, in terms of the capital spending. Like, there's a problem in Canada in the public sector and the private that I find slightly terrifying on productivity. On AI, I think there's an enormous potential for AI to improve productivity. The problem is, because of these structural management, cultural, risk-averse political problems, we haven't been able to capture the benefits of digitization yet. And so a lot of what government does is very amenable to algorithmic management, right? That's not AI, just algorithmic management, and we haven't really harnessed the value of that. And there's enormous potential that is just that the private sector has figured out how to do it, the public sector hasn't. So we haven't caught up with the last revolution. Now, I think what'll happen is we'll do 2 revolutions at once. We'll go from, and if we do this right, we will blow up some very inefficient analog processes that we never really reform for digital algorithmic technology, and we'll take it all the way to AI and we'll get a double benefit. But we have to fix these structural management sort of cultural problems to do that.
Yeah, maybe
Final points?
I agree with that very strongly. I mean, Fisheries and Oceans was my last deputy position. Like, we didn't even have, I didn't even have access to all of the data in the department, right? The data was sitting in different silos. So, the idea of, as Mike says, there's a lot of potential. There's probably more potential for AI in government than almost anywhere else. Government is very much about information, managing information, ensuring compliance, that kind of thing. And AI could simplify, streamline a lot of that, but you haven't even got your data in one place. But I think that this may force government to do it all at once. One of the challenges with AI is accountability and understanding not just what the right decision is, but how the decision gets made. And that is going to be challenging government to do. The algorithm says, well, you owe more tax, and you say, why? Well, it's just AI, right? We don't know why. It's just it's just spat out of the machine. So, there's going to be a challenge there. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people doing paper pushing in government still, and you could really take an axe to a lot of that. Whether that will actually happen is going to depend on a lot of cultural issues. I mean, if you look at, so I've just come back from the UK, and I was in London. Quickest way to get around London is London Underground. And almost all of the London Underground still has drivers in trains, right? Like, and I did my PhD at UBC in Vancouver, and I arrived there in 1988, and the SkyTrain is driverless. And almost more than 30 years later, like, we still don't have driverless trains in the London Underground here in Ottawa. And why is that? It's not because the technology doesn't exist. The technology has existed for 40 years. It's because of the power of the transit unions, and they will push a safetyist argument, which interacts with this safetyist culture, with this risk-averse culture, and prevent the kind of technological change that needs to happen. And we see that in education. You could go a lot further with AI, with digital tools in education than particularly K-12 than we have. I'm sure the same thing is true in healthcare. So I think the potential is there, but there are these cultural issues that need to be got around. And just quickly on housing, again, like one of the reasons we don't have innovation in housing the way we should have is because you have this patchwork quilt of regulatory systems, not just at a provincial level, but at a municipal level, that makes it very, very difficult to produce, let's say, modular housing, which is a good way to increase productivity. If you've got different rules and regulations about what a bathroom has to look like, for instance, in each city, that's a big disincentive to any kind of innovation.
Well, and on that point, we do have a paper coming out, hopefully before the holidays, on construction sector productivity in housing.
No way,
So
there
stay
you go.
tuned.
Look at that.
Stay tuned. Michael, send it to you. Send it to you.
I didn't know that. I
Ask the
wasn't plugging.
Well, there you go. And so this has been a wonderful conversation. I think we have very clear sense of the nature of the problem, and there is much low-hanging fruit that's been identified. Whether the federal or provincial governments will, take it, pick it, that's another question. But I think it speaks to the importance of continuing this work. I think we have the intention of doing so, and particularly looking at the outcomes that we want to associate with these kind of productivity measures going forward. So I want to thank Stephen for his work and all the panelists for their excellent contributions, and to you all for coming. Thank you.